Oh, here we go. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Katie. It's so nice to meet you. If we haven't met before, to give you a little bit of background, I am a pastry chef, a former bakery owner, and I'm so happy to be here teaching baking classes with Michaels through the holiday season. So there's lots of really great holiday classes coming up. Next week, there's like a super cute pumpkin class. We're going to make like little pumpkin cakes and decorate them. And there's all sorts of really amazing Christmas classes as well, and holiday classes. Hi from South Carolina. What a week we've had here in the United States. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope everybody's doing well on both sides. But I'm so excited to kind of like shake all that off and just do some really good baking. So if you are baking along, you'll find that there was a PDF included in the class description. You'll find the recipe for all of the fillings that I'm going to do today there. And for the pie dough as well, which we're going to make from scratch. We're making 3 types of mini pies. An apple pie with a little bit of like a lattice topping, a pumpkin pie, very classic, and a chocolate pecan. So all of those should be really yummy and delicious. I have some that I've already made, so I'll show you those at the end of class. We're going to make the pie dough from scratch. I'm going to show you tips for rolling it out, how to keep it super flaky, all of my secrets to making really amazing pie crusts. I think I make really good pie crusts, so hopefully that'll translate today. And if you do have questions along the way, jump in the chat. Be as vocal as you can. I love chatting. So anytime you want to throw a question at me, please let me know. And maybe, Kana, can you send the link for the recipes when you can? Joanne was just asking. Yes. So that would be great. Maybe she'll include that. Perfect. All right, great. And if you are baking along, let me know. But I will, when Kana gets a chance, she can come down. I know she's probably like uploading that link right now. But I have all my materials here. So I am using this mini tart pan today. This is like the Celebrate mini tart pan, which is so cute. And I love it so much. It's like the perfect little size. So if you do have this, that's amazing. And I definitely recommend it, not just for this class, but it's great for like a variety of little tarts and desserts that you can make year round. But if you don't have this, you can also use a muffin pan. Just a standard muffin tin will work as well. But I do love that this has like the little fluted edges. It's the perfect depth. So you get like that perfect little pie crust. And it's just really lovely. I've also got some ring cutters. I have like a fluted cutter just for fun. We'll maybe use that. I have some standard round cutters. I have some fun things for decoration. Like I have this little mini leaf cutout, which is so cute. We'll use that for the little pumpkin pies. I've got one of these. If you have like a little piping tip or anything you like to use for like little tiny cutouts, say for like Linzer tarts and things like that, this can be really helpful as well. I'll show you how to avoid having to make lattice by using one of these. Rolling pin, I've got all of my materials here, and these are basically pantry staples. I've got sugar, brown sugar, cinnamon, spice, pecans. I have honey or corn syrup for the pecan pie. You can use either one. Today I'm actually using honey. For the pies I already made, I did use corn syrup. Some pumpkin puree. And the apple filling is simply a cooked mix of apples and butter and sugar, and that's really delicious as well. We'll talk about that later. For the pie crust itself, very simple ingredients. This is an all butter pie crust. I do prefer all butter, but there is, there are reasons to use shortening in the place of butter, or at least for part of it, for certain pies as well. We'll talk about that. But all-purpose flour, sugar, salt. I've got my cubed butter and my water in the refrigerator, keeping those super cold. And we'll talk about why that is. And I also have a food processor, just to make the process really simple. You don't need to have your food processor out for this. You can do it by hand. You can also use your stand mixer to make the pie dough, whatever method you prefer. I'll talk about those as I go through. But that's pretty much it. That's the lay of the land. So we're going to get started. We're going to jump right in. But again, if anybody has questions along the way, please let me know. And I do love making pie. I have to say, pies are probably up there as, if not my favorite dessert, definitely one of my favorites, for sure. All right, so I'm going to move all this out of the way. Get this cutting board out of the way for a minute, because I'm going to scoot over my food processor. And so when we're making pie crust, there are a few things that you want to keep in mind. And this pie crust recipe will work for any standard pie. This is going to make a single crust. So if you do love this recipe, keep it on hand for Thanksgiving. I'm going to grab my butter and water. Have those ready to go. But there are a few key tips to making really delicious, flaky, perfect pie crust. we're going to talk about that today. So the reason I'm using the food processor, I love the way that the food processor cuts up the butter into really small pieces with very minimal effort. If you're using a stand mixer, it does the same thing as well, just takes a little bit longer to get it there by using a paddle. If you're trying to cut in your butter by hand, the warmth of your hands tends to warm up that butter so much that you're kind of losing out on those little bits of cold butter throughout your pie crust. And that's what makes the flakiest crust, are those little tiny bits of butter running through. So you'll see I cubed my butter nice and small, just little bits. And all I'm going to do is get my flour, my salt, and my sugar into my food processor. And it's going to do all the work for me, which is very nice. Sugar in, salt in. If you are using salted butter, you can cut back on that salt a little bit. And then I'm just going to go ahead and give it a quick pulse before I add my butter, just to make sure that all of those items are mixed through. I'm not going to get any big clumps of salt running around. Just a very quick blitz. I'm going to get my butter in. And again, this is straight out of the fridge. You'll see methods that call for grating your butter. You can do that as well. Then you can actually avoid using the food processor altogether if you use frozen grated butter. I do like that method also. But all I'm going to do is work this just until the butter is in very small pieces. We talk about pea-sized as a good thing to look for, and we'll look at what that is. And yes, you can use a sugar substitute. You can even leave out the sugar entirely if you prefer, for a very neutral, like what we would call a pâte brisée, where it would be just a savory crust. You can leave out the sugar as well for that. Give it a pulse. All right, it's moving through, and you don't want to overdo it. This is very quick. If you are making a double pie crust, you can feel free to double this for that. And you'll see if you kind of look at my hand here. You see there aren't any of those big chunks of butter left. They are sort of pea-sized. Like this is the biggest chunk I can find. That's perfect. And you see how quick that was. That was probably about, I don't know, a few seconds. Now, what I don't like to do is add my water right to the food processor. And the reason for that is by the time you work your water in, the dough tends to overwork. And overworked dough becomes rubbery pie dough. So I don't love to add the water to the food processor. I'm going to get the food processor out of the way. Grab a bowl. And I know this sort of makes like using another bowl part of the process. And I don't love that either because I'm not big as like washing things, but the results make it worth it. Because if you've ever made like a rubbery pie crust before, and you're like, why does my pie crust always come out so rubbery? It's most of the time it's overworking your crust. And would this work with gluten-free flour? It absolutely would. The same recipe, 1-for-1, you can use an all-purpose gluten-free flour substitute. I've definitely done that before, and it's totally successful and great, and no issues there. All right, so you'll notice a range in the recipe. Anytime you see a pie crust recipe and you see a range of water, the reason for that is sometimes, depending on the method, we talked about using a food processor, a stand mixer, using your hands, the level that you warm up the butter hydrates the flour. So if I was doing this with my hands and I mixed in my butter and it sort of melted some of the butter with the heat of my hands, that moisture content in the butter itself is going to hydrate the flour. I need less water in that case. If I'm using something like frozen grated butter, you'll notice that you need more water because the butter is so cold, it hasn't hydrated the flour at all. So that's why there's always a range of water called for. Maybe the recipe developer doesn't know exactly how you're going to cut in your butter. So just on, erring on the side of caution, they're going to say 2 to 4 tablespoons or 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup. So you always want to start with less, whatever that first amount is. If it's 2 tablespoons, if it's a 1/4 cup, whatever that beginning of the range is, start with that. And all I'm going to do is sort of drizzle it in. And first, just give it a mix with your spatula. We're just going to work it in. And you're going to notice I'm not overworking it. I'm just mixing it. I'm just making sure that everything is combined. This is the secret to the flakiest pie crust. Now the test is, I can look at it and I can say, wow, that looks really shaggy. I'm going to take my hand and just clump it. Does it hold together or does it fall apart? Right now it's falling apart. So I'm going to add a little bit more water and do the same thing. The more gentle you are with your pie crust, the lighter and flakier your pie crust will be. All right, same thing. I kind of like use my fingers just to move it around. And I'm going to clump it together. You see how it holds? That's it. That's all you need to do. Don't feel like you have to overwork it. Okay, make sure there aren't any real dry sections. I'm feeling pretty good. It's like lightly moistened throughout. Maybe a little tad dry, a little bit more. Just a scooch. And we're actually going to work with this right away. We're not even going to chill this dough. All right, so at this point, let's transfer to the countertop. I feel like I should get you guys a little closer. Let's get you a smidge closer here. It's going to cut off my head when I'm talking to you, but that's fine. So with my hands, I'm going to take my palms, and I'm just going to push away from me just to bring it together. Bring it back. Scooch it together. You notice I'm not really kneading it. I'm not really doing anything too drastic. All I'm doing is scooching it together. That's it. And you're going to see when this bakes up, it's going to be like shards of flaky, beautiful, buttery dough. It's going to be so gorgeous because we didn't overhydrate it. We didn't work it so much that we built up gluten. We just gently brought it together. And if this feels weird to you, if you're like, wow, this is like way too crumbly for me, I want my dough to like really stick together, give it time. If I'm working this into a disc right now, and let's say I was going to put this in the fridge and chill it, what happens is when you wrap this up and you kind of give it a press and then you pop it in the fridge, it continues to hydrate the dough. So it's going to really come together just as smooth as you want your dough to be, but without ending up with a rubbery result. So that's it. That's our pie dough. Now we're going to work with this right away. If you are making this at home and you're maybe a little less comfortable with working with stickier doughs and things like that, wrap it in plastic wrap, pop it in the fridge for half an hour, just until it firms up. Any longer than that, if you leave it in the fridge, let's say for a day or two, which you can do as well, make sure you leave it at room temperature for about 10 minutes before you work with it. That's going to soften it enough that you're not going to struggle so much with rolling it out. It's just going to become a little easier to manage. All right, so I'm just washing the butter off my hands. Give me one moment for that. If you've had butter on your hands before, you know that this takes a minute. But any questions about the pie dough? Any thoughts, any questions? All right, we're going to roll her out. So the trick to rolling out pie dough is to keep it moving. That's the biggest thing, is to always keep it moving. The more you can keep it moving, the less likely it is to stick to anything, the more you're going to get the shape that you're looking for. I'm lightly dusting my surface. I've got a rolling pin. This is a French pin. I like using a French pin, but if you have a rolling pin with handles, that's great as well. If you like those little guides that show you how thick it should be, that's great also. We're basically looking for a very thin dough. Typically, if I'm rolling pie dough for a standard pie, I'm going to go between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. Here, because we're making such tiny, delicate tarts, go more for that 1/8 of an inch. So it's going to be very thin, almost like the thickness of cardboard. That's what we're going for. So I'm put my pie dough right in the middle. And you'll see, even it sat for a minute. It really came together nicely. It hydrated itself. It sat. It still feels cold to the touch because my butter was cold, my water was cold. If you're touching your dough and you're like, mine is sticky, I'm not sure. Give it time to chill. Don't rush it. Give it time to rest. It's going to relax the gluten. It's also going to chill the fat in the dough and just generally make it easier to work with. So all I'm going to do is, if I'm rolling a standard pie crust and I want to go in a round, I'm going to move my dough in different directions to create that round. Here for our tarts, it's not going to matter quite as much because we're going to be cutting out circles. But you'll notice as I go, I'm going to move my dough constantly. And this is going to feel silly to you. You're going to be like, why am I constantly stopping to move this dough? But especially if you're working with fresh dough like I am, you're going to constantly move it to keep it from sticking to your surface. And just to make sure that you don't run into any problems. If you need to, a little bit more flour. Another option is to roll out your pie dough using parchment paper, which can be really fun, especially for something like tarts where you're not really worried about the shape. You could pop it between 2 sheets of parchment and just roll it out nice and thin. And you'll notice mine is sort of like cracking apart in this area. I don't need to worry about it being perfect because I'm cutting out circles, but if you are rolling this out for a standard pie crust, at any point you can stop, you can pinch those cracks together, you could plug them with a little bit of the dough from the side, whatever you need to do is good. And you'll see at all times, I should be able to kind of like lift my dough and move it around like this. Is there such thing as working the dough, overworking the dough? Absolutely. It's hard to overwork the dough when you're rolling it. This rolling process is really just about thinning it out to a certain thickness. But when we add the water, that's where you can really overwork your dough. Anytime you're hydrating any sort of flour-based baked good, water hits flour and it creates gluten. It sort of, causes those proteins to strengthen up in your flour. And that's what creates an overworked dough. If I'm really kneading it once my water hits my flour. So we're getting pretty thin. Right now we're at about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to keep going again because I want it to be like a little bit thinner. And if at any point you're having trouble moving it around, just roll it up. Add a little bit more flour. Roll it back out again. And then you should be able to kind of scoot it around as you need to. All right, so not too thin, not too thick. Now this recipe, it's going to make about 10 or so tarts, especially if I'm saving some of the dough for lattice. If you want to make more, you could definitely make more. And before I cut, I really want to make sure it's not sticking because I don't want to lose any of my tarts along the way. Now, the more times you roll this dough, when we talk about overworking, the more times you roll a dough, in essence, you're sort of kneading it, right? Every time you roll it out, you're sort of kneading it. Oh, good question. As the dough is getting thinner, how do you keep it from tearing as you move it around? So you'll notice at this point, it's a little harder to lift. Before, when it was smaller and thicker, I could kind of pick it up and move it around without any problems. If I want to move it around when it's this thin, you see how I kind of roll it up on this first and just really make sure it's nicely floured. And then I can kind of move it around as I need to. But don't worry so much about tears. I feel like people get nervous about tearing. Think about it. Once this goes into your pie crust, you just take your fingers. You could take a little bit of excess dough. You see I have a little crack here. Just plug it up. Nothing's going to happen. No one's going to know it's there. It's just going to bake right in. You're not going to have any problems. It'll be perfect. Perfect. All right. So let's grab our tart pan. So you want to go about a little bit bigger than your tarts. Here I have this red cutter. You'll see this is about, I would say maybe like a shy 1/2 inch on either side. So about 1 inch bigger than my tart itself. And you want to go as close together as possible. Again, we don't want too many scraps. The more scraps we have, the more times we have to re-roll our dough, the more we're working our dough. So kind of like before you go in, really make sure you're measuring it out and going as close together as you can. Give your cutter a little flour if it needs it. Go right next to each other. Make sure you go all the way through. These cutters have been with me probably for, I want to say like 15 years. So like they're not that sharp anymore. I feel like I really have to, I have to like really wrestle with it. All right, now before I start re-rolling these, because I know that I want some little leaves, just to eliminate how many scraps I'm going to be re-rolling. At this point, for my pumpkin pies, I do want a couple of these. So I'm just going to take this opportunity just to punch out my little leaves. And if you have these little like leaf punchers, I feel like they're so fun. They just make like the cutest little guys. And I like to actually cut them in half. So I have like little separate leaves. More leaves. And we're going to bake those right next to our tarts, so they'll turn nice and golden brown and crispy, and they'll just make a nice topping. to kind of decorate the tarts after they're done. So I'll just do one more of those. And then we're going to fit our dough into our tart shells. So cute. All right, and we did talk about, just if anybody's curious, so shortening versus butter. I do love butter, and the main reason to use butter is purely flavor, right? Butter, while shortening is 100% fat, butter contains about 10%, maybe 15%, depending on the type of butter that you're using, of water. And so if you think about water, the way we talked about flour and how flour reacts with water and it creates gluten, that's not great for pie dough, right? It sort of can give you that risk of creating a more rubbery pie dough. You could have issues rolling it out as the butter warms up, some temperature fluctuations. There are some issues that come with using butter. So that's why shortening can be really a nice advantage, because shortening is much more stable at room temperature. It doesn't have any moisture in the mix that's going to create gluten. And so overall, if you're adding, let's say 50% butter and 50% shortening to your pie dough, you could have an easier time. To me, that flavor difference just isn't worth it, but you can do it. If you are maybe like a little bit less comfortable with working with stickier doughs, it does make it a little bit easier. So you see how I just pressed it in? And what's nice about it is if you get the right size, it's just flush, right, with your tart shell. Now remember, when you're pushing it, whether you're using a big pie shell or little ones like this, I don't want to push so hard. I don't want to stretch it. That's going to cause it to shrink in the oven as it bakes. So all I'm doing is kind of laying it on top, just gently coaxing it in. Just pushing from the sides until it kind of lays in there all by itself. Just like that. Perfect. And again, if you have any cracks on the way or anything like that, just pinch them together. There's nothing to worry about. What do you think about butter flavored Crisco? I mean, I get it. It does make it easier. It's definitely also more affordable than butter. Nothing wrong with it. To me, like, I'm an all butter gal. I love butter. I put butter in everything. I just love butter. So I'm like, especially salted butter. I do love a salted butter pie crust. I feel like the salt content is just like a little bit higher. Not that you can't add your own salt. But something about salted butter just really evenly distributes the salt through the crust and just makes it extra delicious. But shortening, has its virtues for sure. All right, where should I put the last two? Let's just stick them in the middle. All right, so the next thing we're going to do before we get into our fillings, while our counter is still all messy with flour and all that, we are going to do our lattice, just so it's ready to go. And then we'll just refrigerate it until we're ready to use it. So it's not going to warm up too much. And that's actually going to even make it easier to use and transport onto the tops. But that's it. Now, if you wanted to use these and par bake them, you could do that. You could just fill them with cupcake liners. Just put a cupcake liner in each one, fill it with dried beans or pie weights, whatever you want, and you can bake them until they're golden brown, just like this, and use them for ganache fillings, cream fillings, anything that you want. You could do that as well. We are not going to par bake them because we're just going to put our fillings in and just bake them all the way through. But I am going to set these aside. And we talked about scraps and not overworking scraps. So I feel like the most tempting thing for people to do when they have a bunch of scraps like this is to take it and just like knead them and really work them together. We talked about overworking dough. That is probably the easiest way to overwork a dough, to just sit here and like really mash these together. But I get it, sometimes it's hard to get this together, right? So you have a couple of options. You can just very lightly give it a quick push to bring it together. That's fine. You can use parchment paper. And I'll show you what that looks like, just for those maybe who are unfamiliar. Grab a sheet of parchment, a little bit of flour, which you don't even really need for parchment paper, and just fold it over. Give it a light press. And now I'm just going to roll it out. And the parchment just helps to kind of keep those scraps together a little bit. I'm just going to roll it. I'm not too worried about what shape I'm getting. I am making lattice out of this, so I do want sort of like some sort of rectangle situation would be nice, but don't worry too much about it. And let's check where we're at. Pull this off. And we could check our thickness. Now, if you're like, oh, it's sticking, a little bit of flour. Flip it over. And do the other side. And now you have a pie dough that you can just pick up and move around as you need. So parchment can be really helpful, especially for even large pie crusts. Parchment can be a real game changer when you're working with sticky doughs. I'm just going to roll this out a little bit more just to make it a little touch thinner. For lattice, you do want it on the thinner side because obviously you don't want like a super chunky lattice on top of your pie crust. That just wouldn't be as pretty and delicate. So just a little bit. And I'm not looking for a circle. I'm looking for more of a squarish because I'm going to be cutting rows. So I'm not too worried about shape. All right, so that's at about 1/8 of an inch. Again, you're looking for about the thickness of like a piece of cardboard. That's what we're looking for, nice and thin. And before you start cutting your lattice, pick it up, really flour it, because the worst thing, you spend all this time cutting neat little rows and then you're not going to be able to pick them up without them sticking to the table. That would be the not fun part. So a knife, a pizza wheel can be really helpful. I find those tend to like zigzag a little bit. So I just go for sort of a standard chef's knife. I'm going to just trim the excess. Don't worry about your edges, but you do want this to be pretty thin. I'm going about maybe 1/4. This is like, I don't know, 1/4, 1/3 of an inch, 1/2 centimeter. Really, whatever you feel in your heart is great. The less comfortable you are with lattice, I would say like the thicker you should go. It'll just be easier to handle. But all I'm doing is cutting little rows. And for one of these tarts, I'm going to use a round. So let me steal that before I use all of this. Oh, I feel bad taking all of that. Oh, too bad. In the interest of science, we're taking this. All right, so I'm stealing one to use my cutouts. We'll put that aside. Let's keep going with our lattice. But yes, if you're like, I hate lattice, I'm going to show you an alternative that's just as cute. But I do love a lattice topped apple pie. You can do this ahead if you want to do, let's say you're making these for Thanksgiving and you want to bake them fresh the day of. I would do the pie crust part ahead. I would make the lattice ahead, leave those on a separate plate, like I'll show you. I would make these ahead. You could even wrap them and freeze them for a couple weeks if you want to before you bake them. That would be fine. But so all I'm going to do is start putting my lattice together. Now, if you're not comfortable with lattice, this is kind of fun because it just gives you the opportunity to kind of like freeform it. I want to move this out of the way, but I cannot. So I'm going to do it over here. If you guys can't see, let me know. But all I'm going to do is start doing just like this. Remember, with lattice, it's the same as weaving. And I know you guys are crafters, so probably used to this, but over under is what we're looking for here. If you find your lattice is difficult to work with, maybe it's sticking, maybe it's falling apart a little bit, just pop all of it in the refrigerator. Just put it onto a piece of parchment or a plate and just move it to the fridge, let it chill. That'll be much easier to work with. So I don't know how many we're going to get out of this, but we do want to clear the pie crust. So that's clearing it pretty good. So all I'm going to do is start lifting and stacking. So we're going over, under, over, under. These two. And even if you're making a big pie and you want to do a lattice top, You can do it just on parchment paper without doing it right on your pie. So it kind of gives you the ability to like fuss a little bit more without it touching your fruit or whatever filling you have. And then you could just literally flip it onto your pie, which makes it a lot easier for sure. Ooh, excuse me. There we go. This is so fun. I find lattice very relaxing and also somewhat stressful at the same time. I don't know if anybody else feels like that, but it's like awesome and very zen, but also like, ah. All right, we're almost there. And so I did mention, so this recipe makes about 10. I'm divvying it up today so I can make you about 3 of each. That's why my batch is looking small here. I want to make all the kinds. But if you do make this recipe, kind of choose, are you making all of them? Are you making just one of them? And then you can, you know, change your method as needed. You may not need the lattice at all. You may only need lattice. Then you might want to make a little bit extra pie dough to give yourself some room. All right, at this point, I'm probably going to get, if I'm making 3, I've got 1, I need 2, I need 3, that's plenty for me. So just to make sure they don't move around too much, I'm just going to take my hands and give them a press, just to stick them together. You do want to make sure you have some sort of spatula to lift these guys up. So like a nice big one is good. And then I'm going to look at my tarts and say, okay, which of my little guys fits? Now I don't want it bigger, I want it exact. So I've got my fluted. I'm going to take him, go to the cutest spot I can find, and just give it a press right in. Be very confident. Wiggle it around, take off your excess. You can move it to the edge of the table if it helps, just to lift it onto your hand. And then you've got a cute little lattice top. So I'm going to put this on a plate or on my parchment paper. I could put it in the fridge and chill it until I'm ready to work with it. We don't want it sitting at room temperature and melting our butter. Again, squeeze. Take off my excess. Ooh, see, I lifted it without being careful. Come with me. I'll fix you after. Go back in. Stay with me. Move it to the edge of the table. Flop it onto your hand. Make a big mess like I just did. And then have to reposition. Hey. Listen, we all have those. We all have those moments. There we go. You little sneaky. All right, perfect. All right, so we have all these scraps. We could make more. We could do anything. You could make pie crust cookies with these. Put cinnamon sugar, bake them till they're crispy. They're very delicious. But, you know, great for making more tarts. We don't need more tarts right now, but you could make as many as you want. And when we talk about an alternative to lattice, so I have my little guy that I did not lattice. I had my mini cutter someplace. Here we go. If you want to, any size cutter you like. Oh, thank you, Kathy. You know, listen, we gotta make it work, right? Take this guy or any sort of piping tip or anything you have and just plunge it in. And this just makes cute little cutouts. So you don't have to worry about the lattice if you don't want to. I saw grape pie once and somebody cut out like little circles all over it and it was like the cutest thing. And I never made it because I was like, who likes grape pie? But I really like the idea of it. I thought it was super cute. All right, I'm going to put my leaves on here. I'm going to save these cutouts because they're cute. We're just going to put all of this in the refrigerator so it's going to stay cold until we need it. Ta-da. All right, so let's move on to fillings, and then we will be ready to bake and garnish and all of that good stuff. Clean this up a little bit here. How you guys feeling? Let's move all this. Okay. All right. We have a few fillings here. Again, because I'm making like a very tiny batch today, I'm not doing full recipes here. So I'm going to have it. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to have it. Because I feel like if you're like me and you like making a bunch of very tiny things in all different flavors, this can be helpful. So if you can see the pumpkin pie recipe and the pecan pie recipe, you'll notice that they each call for 1 egg. Now I'm going to have those. So does anybody know how to have an egg? And separating the white and the yolk is not the answer, although wouldn't that be nice? But all I'm going to do is, I have a kitchen scale. You can also just eyeball it. You can measure it by tablespoons to divvy it up, whatever you feel. A whole egg weighs about 50 grams. I'm going to do 25 grams in one bowl, 25 grams in the other. And to do that, I'm just going to whisk it up a little bit because I do want the yolk and the white. I don't just want one or the other. Good. All right. Oh, that was way too much. Perfect. That's it. Don't worry too much. A couple grams in either direction is not going to change things all that much. Be totally fine. We're going to make both of these at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and for my pumpkin, let's get a spoon. Pumpkin puree. I like to use brown sugar for my pumpkin pie because I feel like it just really intensifies that flavor. Oh, thanks, Karen. Thank you. Brown sugar, pumpkin pie spice. I like to DIY my pumpkin pie spice because if you have a whole jar of pumpkin pie spice, it's just going to get old throughout the year. So I take a little bit of cinnamon. I do 3-2-1, 3 parts cinnamon, 2 parts ginger, 1 part nutmeg. You could also add something like clove or allspice or anything that you want. But that way you could just kind of mix it up as you need and not get stuck with like a whole bunch of pumpkin pie spice at the end of the season. A little salt. The last thing I'm going to add is my evaporated milk. And if you are making a tiny batch of tarts and you're like, I am not opening a can of evaporated milk for this, you can substitute with half and half if you have half and half. That would be good. And the full recipe does make the full amount of tarts, so about 10 tarts. Maybe like slightly shy, maybe 9 tarts, but it should make the full amount. So I am having it because I'm not going to use all that today. I'm going to give it a whisk. The cornstarch is just to help stabilize it a little bit. And it helps the pumpkin set. Just until it's smooth, add my evaporated or your half and half. Easiest pumpkin pie ever and super delicious. Everything you want it to be. That's it. That's pumpkin, done. Let's move on to our pecan. Now we sort of mentioned corn syrup, honey. Yes, 10 each recipe, exactly. Yes, that's for the pecan and for the pumpkin and for the apple. They each make 10, so you can go ahead and have them to do less. It's hard to go smaller than that because it's such a tiny recipe, but you can. All right, so a little salt. So important for pecan pie. If you've ever had like really flat pecan pie and you're like, why is this so not flavorful? It's probably because they just did not add enough salt. I am using honey today. If you do want to add maple syrup, you could do that as well, or agave. The only difference is it's a little bit more liquidy. You can see like how thick honey is. You can imagine maple syrup is a little bit thinner. So it does tend to sort of brown the tart a bit more quickly. I'm not a big fan. I would say do maybe like half and half honey, half maple syrup, or half corn syrup, half maple syrup. All right, regular sugar. I've got a little pinch of cinnamon in there. That's totally optional. You could add vanilla instead. You could add a splash of bourbon or rum. Would be really delicious. All I'm doing is kind of mixing this together. It's very thick, it's very sticky. That's what we want. Pecan. I like how fast these are. That's it. And to fill up my tarts, I've got a mix. So I've got pecans, I've got like pieces. I also have some chocolate morsels in there. You can mix that up. You could add flavored chips. You could add anything you want to. And now we're going to start assembling. Oh, and I'm sorry, the apple. Ha, ha, ha. So I did make this ahead because it does have to cool. So this is a half recipe of the apple filling. This is apple cooked in with butter, brown sugar. All it is simmered slowly until the apples soften. You want to cool this to room temperature before you use it. Of course, we don't want to warm up our tarts, so you never want to add hot filling to a nice room temperature or cold tart shell. So that's what we're going to do with that. So for my pecan, I'm going to fill it about 2/3 of the way. Load it up. I like mine really chock full. If you don't like yours as chock full, you can go a little less. I'm going to do like 2 or 3. I want to have enough tart shells to do my other ones. I might roll out one more, but we'll go with it. And all you want to do, always give your pecan filling a little bit of a mix before you use it. No matter if you just made it or if you made it a while ago, give it a mix. And this is so goopy and sticky and delicious, and that is fine. And just pour it in and let it sort of like slowly work its way into the nooks and crannies. And you're filling it about 3/4 of the way. You want to make sure everything is sort of coated, even if it's sticking up a bit. You want to make sure that it's just really coated. That's what we're going for. And before I throw those in the oven, I'm going to top them with like a little bit of flaky sea salt, just again to kind of like balance that sweetness a little bit, which is so important for pecan pie. Pecan. I know. I live in New Jersey, you know, we say pecan, which is definitely not as nice as pecan. All right, so that's the pecan. For my pumpkin, you could transfer this to like a liquid measuring cup, might even be easier. All you're doing is filling it up about 3/4 of the way. It's going to puff slightly as it bakes, but not by much. I leave 3 for apple or do 3 pumpkin. I'll let you guys decide while I top my pecan. How many times can I say pecan? A lot. All right, I'm sprinkling a little bit of like a coarse flaky sea salt. That's really going to up that flavor nicely, but that's totally optional. But I do love that. Even a little pinch of kosher salt goes a long way. Let's grab our apple. And do really take the time to cook your apples down until they soften. You should be sort of able to bite into one. And it should be really tender, maybe even just like the very slightest bite, but they should be very soft and almost falling apart. And what's nice about pre-cooking your filling compared to making a filling just straight in the tart itself is that you can taste it and you can adjust it. Does it need a little bit more lemon juice to kind of wake up the flavors with the acidity? Does it need a little bit more brown sugar if you're using Granny Smith versus Honey Crisp, you know, or any kind of apple? You can play with this as much as you want. And I do not add any sort of cornstarch or anything to this filling because they're so small. And because we sort of cooked down the apples, they released a lot of their liquid already. So there's really no reason to thicken this. Now I am mounding them a little bit. Kimberly, I heard you, you said apple, so that's what we're doing. So I'm mounding it up. They are going to cook down slightly, and I do like the look of like a little mounded pie. So be generous. Really fill them up nicely. You could also add in something like, you know, you could throw some cherries in there, some pears, anything you feel, dried cranberries, anything fun and festive. And we're going to grab our lattice. Hold on, because I need this too. So the one thing you need to put this lattice on is a little bit of glue. So that could be egg wash, which I actually recommend the most. I think egg wash is the best thing for this because it's going to give you the most beautiful browning, the nice sheen that you're looking for. If you're feeling lazy like me, I didn't want to waste an egg on it because it's only 3 tarts. A little bit of cream, a little bit more of that evaporated milk is totally great too. And just grab a brush, and all I'm doing is going around the edge of my tart, just my apples. Don't worry about the other kinds. You can egg wash those if you want to, but that's very extra. You don't have to. But all we're looking for is a little bit of glue for this guy. So I'm just brushing my edges. And now the moment of truth. So if they're cold, they're so easy to handle. If they're not cold, this might take you a little bit more effort to get them over. Use a spatula to kind of lift them and move them, but just pinch them down so they make like a really cute little tart. If you got any pieces you want to trim, you could trim and kind of press it together. All of that is good. Even my guy who fell apart is he's gonna make it. I like this spatula. I think this is my favorite spatula. It does everything so nicely. You can adjust, you can lift, you can move, anything you want, but do make sure you kind of press those edges in, because once you lift the pies out of the pan, you really want to know that the top and the edge sticks together. You don't want them to separate. And this guy is super cute with our cutouts, so he's going to go down too. Just kind of push him in a little bit. So fun. And so these guys, my little leaves, you don't want to put them on top, obviously, because they're going to sink right in. So if I'm setting this onto a baking sheet when I bake, let's say I'm putting it right onto here. All I'm going to do is put my leaves and things right next to it. And those are going to bake nicely right alongside. So once they're done, I could just pop them over my finished pies and they'll be beautiful golden brown as well. And these bake for about 25 to 30 minutes at 375. So you want your oven to be preheated before you get them in. Some of them take longer than others. So if you are doing a mixed batch like me, your pumpkin pies might be ready first at like 25 minutes. You might notice they're nicely puffed. They're not jiggly anymore. They're golden brown around the edge. You can take out the entire tray, take a little spatula or a knife, lift those out, and then put your apples back in. The apples take the longest. So that's the downside to making multiple in one batch, but I feel like it's worth it. And they're very easy to pop out, which is great. It's a nice nonstick pan, a tiny little knife or mini offset spatula, and just pop them over. And I'm going to show you now what they look like. Aren't they cute? I feel like they're so fun. And just to show you each one, so like the little lattice guy. He's super cute, he's super fun. A little bit of powdered sugar as a finish, I think is really nice for the apple. So just take like a little duster and just a little bit of powdered sugar. It's so cute, it really brings it together. You could also drizzle like some caramel sauce, would be really lovely. The pumpkin, you can see, so we took our little leaves that bake separately. And after my pumpkin was done, I just put a little leaf right in the middle with some pumpkin seeds on the side. That's kind of fun. And for the pecan, I like to do a little bit of melted chocolate because we put the chocolate inside. If you didn't put chocolate inside, I think they're perfect just the way they are. They're so caramelized and delicious. And I will cut into each of these. So I'll show you what they look like. But a little bit of melted chocolate just drizzled right over the top is such a nice finish. You can see that just kind of like takes it to the next level. It makes it really fancy. Do you grease the mold? No, you don't have to. If you are nervous, if your mold is a little bit older and maybe some of that nonstick is starting to wear off a little bit, a quick spray of like a nonstick cooking spray is great. You definitely do that, but there's definitely no need to use butter or flour or anything like that. That would be perfect. So let me just, I will cut in really fast so you'll see what they look like. And then I get to eat these, which is so good. You can see the pecan is so chock full of stuff, which is the goal. Nice and gooey, but not overly so. That's lovely. You can see how thin the crust is all the way around. Super flaky, which is so nice. Same with our pumpkin. Super tender. You know your pumpkin is perfectly baked when it's just nice and custardy all the way through. Thank you so much, guys. If you're heading out, thank you so much for coming. This will be on YouTube if you want to play it back and make these. You can absolutely do that. This is going to be messy, but I'm going to cut open my apple. Chock full of apples. So yummy. But thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for coming. Kana, if you want to come back up, feel free to come back up when you can. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming. Definitely check out upcoming classes. I have this weird thing right in my way. There we go. Check out upcoming classes in the next week or two. I think next Thursday is the next pumpkin class. Definitely come by for those. Happy baking, happy Thanksgiving. Bye, everybody.